Hi, welcome you all to this special class on Unacademy platform, Unlock platform. Today, as part of our special class, we'll be looking at the reasons for failure of public policies in India. What are the reasons why public policies have been a failure in terms of their implementation, and what can be done by the government to improve their effective implementation, to ensure their effective implementation. This is what we will be discussing today. And before we start our class, we will let us start looking at the offers available on an academic platform in terms of their courses. As you can see here, you can get 6 months free subscription. It is only valid for 1 day. So you can see that there is a annual price hike. This annual price hike on 9th and 16th December. For 1 year on 9th December, it was increased by 1000 rupees. On 16th, that is by tomorrow, it will be increased by 3000 rupees. So it is better if you take admission now itself. If you take admission now itself, because that will help you to save at least 3000 rupees. Then proceeding further, they have started the batches on 15th of December. One batch starts on 10th of December, another batch on 15th of December. These batches are for General Studies 2022 and also 2023 also, and for 2023 also. Then six optional courses were launched from 8th December, and another 6 optional courses were launched from 8th December, and 4 optional courses were launched from 15th of December. 4 courses were launched from 15th of December. What you can do is you can take admission into all those courses. You can take admission into all those courses using our code PKS10. You can take them. They also have a free test series for civil service examination on Monday, wherein 20 MCQs are there, 20 minutes every day, every Monday at 8 p.m. Then daily current affairs test series 15 MCQs. Abhiyan, again 15 MCQs, Friday 10 a.m. This is free test series. You can enroll at any point of time. Then UPSC CSE combat. You have 56 questions. The exam was over on 12th December. Then level up your preparation with the iconic subscription. Live mentoring is there. Study planner is there. Mains question and answers practice also is there. So these are all the batches that were started, and you can take admission into all those batches. Coming back here, let us start with the topic that we are discussing. Reasons for failure of policy implementation in India. This is part of our governance in General Studies, Polity Governance paper. Reasons for failure of policy implementation in India. Why public policies in India are a failure. We will be looking at what are the reasons why they are a failure, and we will also be looking at what can be done by the government to ensure their success. So before going through all those things, let us have a brief introduction about all of them. As we know, after independence, the government of India had opted for a welfare state. With the emergence of democracy, we have opted for what is called a welfare state. The objective of the government is to maximize welfare of people. And we had millions and millions of people who were living below the poverty line, who were not in a position to sustain themselves. They needed government assistance very badly. that led to government actively interfering in the lives of the people by providing them with all kinds of by providing them with all kinds of basic needs of life. In 1970s, it was the then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi who had come out with this slogan "Garibi Hatao," wherein she launched hundreds of developmental welfare schemes targeting different sections of society. Targeting different sections of society. This was launched, and this welfare state has further expanded in 1980s with more number of schemes that were launched, popularly known as anti-poverty schemes or welfare schemes or developmental schemes. Then, with the 1990s, with the emergence of liberalization, privatization, globalization, what happened was there were more. What happened was there were more uh, finances available with the government of India thanks to liberalization, privatization, globalization. Suddenly, the government of India had witnessed huge amount of increase in its revenues. For example, in 1991, the government of India was spending only 9,000 crores of rupees on these welfare schemes, subsidies, and everything else. In 2021 budget, it had gone up to almost 15 lakh crores. So, as you can see here, this is only about the government of India, and at the state level, the state governments will be implementing their own programs, which runs into huge amounts of monies. Now, the question here we are asking here is, in spite of spending so much amount of money, what about their outcomes? Whether they are successful or not is what that we have to ask here. Whether the policies have been successful or not, that's what we have to ask here. If they are not, what is the reason why they are a failure? And what can be done by the government to ensure their success? This is what the topic that we have to discuss here, right? Almost every state in India is indulging in what we call competitive populism. Every state government in India, every political party in India is indulging in competitive populism. So what they are doing as part of this competitive populism is that they are they are what they are doing is they are coming out with hundreds of developmental welfare schemes, huge amount of increase in the revenue expenditure. But is it resulting in outcomes or not? That is what the question that we have to ask. We have a scheme for food, we have a scheme for health, education, and you have the scheme for targeting different sections of weaker sections of society. But why? If at all they are not as successful as they should have been, why they are not successful? For example, as pointed out by the then Prime Minister in 1980s, late Rajiv Gandhi, for every single rupee spent by the government of India, only 15 paisa reached the poor people on developmental welfare schemes. 85% of the money spent by the government of India was going either into administrative expenditure or into the hands of bureaucracy. That is what we call corruption. Similarly, later, after almost 30 years, Planning Commission and then later Niti Aayog have estimated the same. They said that out of if the government has to put 1 rupee in the pockets of a person living below poverty line, the government of India was forced to spend 3 rupees 50 paise. The remaining 2 rupees 50 paise are what we call either administrative expenses or, or this corruption. Clearly showing that policy implementation in India has not been as successful as it should have been. We can give more examples. For example, one of the flagship schemes of the government of India is this Food Security Act. As you must have seen, Food Corporation of India only this year had spent around 2,50,000 crores of rupees. Imagine 2,50,000 crores of rupees only to procure food grains from the farmers at MSP decided by the government of India. 2,50,000 crores of rupees. The same amount of food grains will be given to the state governments to be distributed through PDS, Public Distribution System. As you can see, everywhere there are huge amounts of money are spent, and this money is spent. And when this money is spent, obviously, what is the outcome? When your revenue expenditure is so high, if you look at the budget of the present year, according to the finance minister, more than 85% of the money spent by the government is only on revenue expenditure. It is mostly on subsidies, the rest of the money on interest payments and other forms of revenue expenditure. And the government is borrowing only to finance its revenue deficits. Why? Because revenue expenditure is so high that the revenue receipts can never cover this revenue expenditure. And the major culprit here again is those subsidies. Since the implementation has not been as successful as it should have been, right? Since implementation has not been as successful as it should have been, the outcome is that the government was forced to huge amounts of money. The government was forced to spend huge amount of money only on putting meager amounts of money in the hands of the people. For example, during the pandemic, the government has said that it has provided food grains to 80 crore people through PDS. That is almost equal to 70, 65, 70, 70% of the population. That is almost equal to 65, 70% of our population. According to the government of India, only 22.5% of population are living below poverty line. Then who is this additional 50% of population who are getting those additional benefits, subsidies? That is where we have to talk. So let us look at all the reasons for failure of public policies in India. It starts with, as you can see here on your screen, it starts with policy formulation. It starts with what we call policy formulation. We think that implementation is the process, is the reason for failure. No. It starts with policy formulation. What is the problem with policy formulation? You can see the two reasons here: elite mass model in policy formulation, as well as incrementalism. What is this elite mass model says? It says that these public policies, whether at the central level or at the state level, are formulated by elite sections of society. That means those who are rich, powerful, educated, they are the ones who formulate the policies. And they formulate the policies for what we call ordinary masses. These ordinary masses constitute a huge amount of vast sections of our society. And these elite sections, what we say, microscopic minority. When these elite sections formulate policies, what is their objective? Obviously, do they want these ordinary masses to be fully empowered, to be fully developed? Obviously not. Why? Because if ordinary masses are developed, they would become competition to this ruling elite. That's the reason why this ruling elite, it makes sure that these ordinary masses will always remain poor only. They remain poor only. They make sure that these ordinary masses will always be poor only. They formulate policies which are based on what is called incrementalism. That is what the next point also we see here. So what are we saying here? When they come out with policies, they'll make sure that these policies will benefit only, they will benefit only the poorer sections of society on a short-term basis. That means these policies will only maximize their welfare in the immediate short term. They will never empower them in the long term. The policies are formulated in such a manner that poor people will always remain poor. That is the objective here. Poor people will always remain poor. Why all these anti-poverty schemes are a failure? The questions are repeatedly asked in our political governance paper. Why these anti-poverty schemes are a failure? For the simple reason that they are not anti-poverty schemes, they are anti-poor schemes. This is what we say. They are anti-poor schemes, not anti-poverty schemes. For example, if you are giving them rice, can we make them rich? Obviously not. If you are giving them 100 days of employment, can you make them rich? Obviously not. And that is what we do in the name of welfare. In the name of welfare, what we are doing is that we are making these poor people dependent on the government for their survival forever. Poor people have no option but to depend on the government for their survival, because they are so poor that it is not possible for them to buy anything from the market. As we say, these poor people are completely left out of urban economies. Another question that was asked in our political governance paper. They are completely left. Why? You can become part of an economic system. You can become part of markets only when you can become part of markets only when either you are part of the supply side or from the demand side. That means either you are a producer or a consumer. These poor people, if you look at them, they are not consumers. Why? Because you can call a person consumer only when he has the ability to buy goods and services from the market. Only when he has the ability to buy goods and services from the market. For that, he needs income. He is so poor that he is never part of this consumer market. Is he a producer? Obviously not. He neither have the money nor capabilities to be a producer. Can he contribute to the economy from the supply side in the form of his labor? Can he become a worker in industrial operations? No. Why? Because he does not have any skills. This is what is happening in India. Poor people will remain poor permanently. They will be poor all the time. And they will be depending on the government for their survival again all the time. That is where the problem is with India. That is the reason why, as I said, these I call them not anti-poverty school programs. They are anti-poor schemes. Why? Because all these schemes, at the end of the day, what do? They will make sure that poor people will always remain poor. How? By giving them temporary relief from poverty through these welfare schemes. Temporary relief from poverty. For example, during the corona crisis, what the government of India has done during the corona crisis, these poor people are given 5 kilos of additional rice or additional wheat, 5 kilos of additional food grains. Is it enough for them to come out of their poverty? Is it enough for them to become rich? Obviously not. It is only enough. It is only enough for them to. It is only enough for them to either escape from poverty and hunger for only a short period of time. Only for a short period of time. Again, the government is giving them only rice or wheat and pulse, 1 kilo of pulses. But what about vegetables? What about oil? What about fruits? Are they given these things? Obviously not. In spite of so many years of our welfare state, our Food Security Act is only restricted to you know, you know, uh, right? In spite of in spite of our welfare state of 75 years of welfare state, our welfare only is at a preliminary stage in the form of giving them only food grains. In the form of giving them only food grains. What about nutritious food? What about What about giving them quality food? Obviously, that is not part. That is the reason why malnourishment among children is very high. Right? Exactly, Sunidhi. That's what I am saying. It was only temporary. Right? Now, after this pandemic is over, the government will withdraw that also. Then what will the poor people do? Do they have any employment? Do they have an employment so that they can get incomes? so that they can buy the food grains from the market? Do they have any education to get productive employment? Not at all. Why? Because I said elite mass model. The objective of the governing elite, the ruling elite, is to keep all these ordinary masses poor, backward, and illiterate. That is where the problem is. And the government, what will the government do? In the name of welfare, the government will make sure that there is only insignificant improvement in the lives of poor people. There is only insignificant improvement in the lives of poor people, which ultimately makes it sure that poor people will always remain poor. That is what I am trying to say here. After 75 years of independence, why no government talks about better health care? Why no government talks about quality education to people? Why no government talks about improving infrastructure in rural areas? Why no government talks about industrialization? Have you ever seen any political party making these promises to the people? On the other hand, what is the promise made by the Congress party in 2019 elections? It has said that we will give them poor people 6,000 rupees per month, 72,000 rupees as part of this Nyay scheme. Where will you get this money? Can you remove poverty by giving poor people money? And for how long will you give this kind of money? Where is the money with the government? If you look at the present government itself, in the last 7 years, they have borrowed 73 lakh crores of rupees. In the first 65 years of independence, we have borrowed 70 lakh crores of rupees. In only 5 years, the present 7 years, the present government has borrowed 73 lakh crores of rupees. Who will pay for it? When people are given, poor people are given this 5 kilos of rice during the pandemic, the government is also charging from them around 80 rupees only as tax on petroleum products, 70 rupees, 80 rupees on tax on petroleum products. That means the government is giving to them with one hand, it is taking away with another hand. Similarly, take the case of farmers. In case of farmers, the government is giving them as part of Kisan 6,000 rupees per annum. 2,000 rupees are given after every 4 months. 2,000 rupees are given. And what is the government doing? The government is taking away, giving them with one hand, taking away everything with another hand with the diesel prices. The taxes on diesel have increased by 40 rupees in the last, in the last 1.5 to 2 years or so. That means, if a farmer is using a certain amount of diesel for his tube wells and bore wells, he is paying more to the government than what he is getting from the government, right? He is paying more to the government than what he is getting from the government. Why? Because, as I said, the governments have only what we call a very narrow perspective about the development process. They do not want poor people to become rich. It is as simple as that. They simply do not want poor people to become rich. That is what we said, elite mass model. In the name of development, there is only an insignificant improvement in their lives, what we call incrementalism. This is the reason why public policies are a failure. As I said, at the end of the day, they are not poverty removal schemes. At best, they can be called poverty alleviation schemes. Again, this question was asked in our polity governance papers. Poverty alleviation, but not poverty removal. What is the difference here between poverty removal and poverty alleviation? When we say poverty removal, that is, you are completely removing poverty of the poor people by making sure that they get productive employment, and that productive employment will be helping them to get regular income. That regular income will ultimately make sure that they are above poverty line. That is what we say poverty removal. But in reality, what do we see here? In reality, what we see here is that it is only what we call poverty alleviation. That is, providing temporary relief, to the people from poverty, through these welfare schemes. As I said, giving a free rice. For how long will you give the free rice to the poor people? As long as they are poor. If the government is spending all its money only on providing rice, what about education? What about health? What about infrastructure? What about industries? This is where the problem is. This is where public policies are a failure in India. Next, proceeding further. What are the other reasons why public policies are a failure in India in terms of their implementation? What are the other reasons? Top-down approach to policy implementation. This is where again problem is. What is this top-down approach that we are talking about to policy implementation? What is this top-down approach? What we are saying here is that policies are formulated at the top. Beneficiaries will be decided at the top. And they will be implemented at lower levels. People at lower levels are neither consulted nor involved nor allowed to participate in implementation process. Top-down approach. This is what we call a one-size-fits-all approach. Again, the questions are asked. This one-size-fits-all approach is the one which is mostly responsible for failure of public policies in India. What are we talking about here as part of this one-size-fits-all approach? For example, take any of the policies of the government of India, the so-called flagship schemes of the government. The entire country will have a single scheme. India has so much of diversity. Can a single scheme for the entire country, can it result in success? Obviously not. Take the case of NREGA, a simple scheme. For example, in a state like Punjab and Haryana, you don't require any NREGA. Why? Because they have 3 crops in a year. Farmers will have work all through the year. So is the case with agricultural laborers. They have work all through the year. And then, on the other hand, in a state like say Rajasthan, which is mostly a dry state, 100 days of employment is not sufficient. 100 days of employment cannot be enough for people there, because still remaining to 65 days they don't have any work to do also. So can we have this kind of one-size-fits-all approach? For example, Irrigation Ministry allocates money to the state governments, conditional grants. It says that money should be used for improving irrigation facilities, or you can say it says that money should be used for flood control. Irrigation Ministry says that we are giving you money and this money should be used for flood control. In a state like Assam, the money can be used very well because floods are a serious problem there in Assam. But where are floods in Rajasthan? Where are floods in central part of India? Where are floods in North Karnataka? Where are floods in Telangana? Where are floods in Vidarbha? What will happen to that money? It will remain unspent. This is where the problem is. One-size-fits-all approach, the questions are repeatedly asked. This one-size-fits-all approach is the one which is responsible for a complete failure of public policies in India. This one-size-fits-all approach. Obsession with the centrally sponsored schemes is what that is responsible for the failure of public policies. For example, take within the state itself, take the case of Uttar Pradesh, Western Uttar Pradesh, fairly developed thanks to the fact that green revolution had taken place. And on the other hand, Gorakhpur, Eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bundelkhand, all these regions, they are fairly underdeveloped. So within the state itself, there is so much of differences, geographical differences. So how can a single policy be there for the entire country? How can a single policy be there for the entire country? And that is the reason why most of these public policies will always be a failure. top-down approach, one-size-fits-all approach. These are the ones which result in the failure of public policies in India. Next one is bureaucracy. Next point, as you can see it on your screen, is bureaucracy-centric implementation processes. Unfortunately, whichever government that comes to power, whether it is the central level or at the state level, they have so much of faith in bureaucracy than in ordinary people, than in stakeholders. Whatever may be the government that is in power, they will always make sure that it is the bureaucracy that is given the ultimate responsibility of implementing the policies. And the bureaucracy, which is trained for regulatory purposes, regulatory administration purposes, neither has the aptitude, skills, nor the attitude, values to implement the policies. And that results in failure of policies. Bureaucracy mostly looks at rules and regulations. They mostly looks at hierarchical procedures. Because tomorrow their performance is evaluated in terms of their ability to implement those rules and regulations. And that is where bureaucracy becomes a failure. It results in what we call goal displacement. Instead of maximizing welfare of people by implementing the policies, bureaucracy is so much obsessed with rules and regulations. At the end of the day, they will simply be a failure. Because as I said, they neither have the aptitude nor the attitude to ensure the success of those public policies. And whatever may be the reasons best known to the government, whatever may be the reasons best known to the government, any government, whether it is a central or state, they always show huge amount of faith in bureaucracy. That is where again policies are a failure. Next, what are the other reasons why? Next important reason why these policies are a failure is because of high levels of secrecy in implementation. According to the latest reports of the Government of India, the Government of India is implementing not one or two, around 2,100 schemes targeting different sections of society, benefiting various regions of the country. 2,100 schemes. How many people in villages know about all these schemes? How many of them know about all these 2,100 schemes? Forget about that. How many of them know about at least 10 schemes? How many of them know about at least 10 schemes? Forget about 2,100 schemes. That is where we say high levels of secrecy. As we study in our ethics paper also, wherever there is secrecy, there is always scope for corruption. There is always scope for manipulation. There is always scope for misuse and abuse. There is always scope for nepotism and favoritism. And this is where the problem is. High levels of secrecy in implementation. This is where again the problem is. Bureaucracy, basically you find that they are extremely uncomfortable with any kind of transparency in administration. Why? Because we have continued with the colonial bureaucracy. We have continued with colonial bureaucracy. The same kind of bureaucracy that was introduced first by East India Company and later by the Britishers. It's more than 300 years. It's more than 300 years. This 300 years of colonial bureaucracy has only worked under extremely secretive conditions. Highly secretive. Britishers deliberately made sure that this administrative system and governance structures are highly secretive in nature. Why? Because the entire British administrative system was highly exploitative in nature. And if ordinary people come to know about this exploitation, they will revolt against the British government. And what do we say here? Unfortunately, after independence, we have not made any changes to our colonial administrative structures. And one of the important features of that colonial administrative structures is this high levels of secrecy. And the worst part of it here is that it is the people who are supposed to benefit out of all these schemes. At the end of the day, the government says that everything is done only for the sake of the people. And the bureaucracy says that they are working for people. We call them as civil servants, servants of the people. But neither the political executive nor bureaucracy is at all interested in ensuring transparency in administration. Why? Because through secrecy, they can indulge in massive levels of corruption, misuse, and abuse of power. As I said, 2,100 schemes are implemented, out of which people might be knowing about 6 or 7 schemes, maximum 10 schemes. Rest of all other schemes, the beneficiaries will be there on paper. Money will be deposited into the accounts of the so-called beneficiaries. And then the money will be withdrawn by bureaucracy only. As you can see, sometime back in Jharkhand, what happened? The stipend given by the state government to minority students. The bureaucrats there, the district administration, joined hands with the local officials, everyone. They took the signatures of these minority students and they started withdrawing all the money, resulting in massive levels of corruption. Why? Because high levels of secrecy. This is where again the problem is. And then the next point you can see on the screen, complete absence of stakeholder participation in implementation. Another important reason why we find that this policies is a failure. One of the important reasons why the policies are a failure is a complete absence of stakeholder participation. As I have mentioned earlier, we continued with these colonial structures, and the Britishers made sure that Indians would never participate in governance, either in terms of implementation or in terms of formulation. And that is the reason why we have a situation wherein the government is implementing these 2,100 schemes for people, but there is no scope for participation of people in implementation. The irony here is that the government says that they are only working for people, but not working with the people. That is where the problem is. The government can never think of working with people. That is what the difference we say between ruling and governing. The government believes only in ruling but not in governing. What is the difference here between ruling and governing? Ruling means you consider yourself as a master and you believe that it is your right to rule over your subjects, that is the people. Governing means you consider yourself as a servant of people and you will work towards maximizing their welfare, treating them as your masters. We have only, unfortunately, since independence, we have only rulers, but not those who will govern the systems, administrators. That is where the problem. And that is the reason why we have complete absence of stakeholder participation in implementation. Right? Then what are the other reasons why these policies are a failure? Next reason, as you can see here, conflict between objectives of citizen empowerment and welfare maximization. This is where again we find very serious lacunae in policy implementation. As we have discussed this point earlier also. What we have said here is that if you look at it, every government says that they wanted to empower the citizens. They want to develop the people. They want to improve their standard of life. They want to provide productive employment to them. They want to improve their skills. They want to improve infrastructure. And they want to ensure rapid industrialization. These are all the laudable objectives of the government. But at the end of the day, what every government does is They only give importance to welfare maximization. As I said, citizen empowerment is what is called anti-poverty, poverty removal, whereas welfare maximization means only poverty alleviation. Even take the present government also. For example, I'll just give you one or two examples for you to understand this. In 2014, BJP came to power by promising 2 crore jobs every year. By 2019, they must have provided at least 10 crore jobs, which obviously they did not. So what did the government do? Just before elections, they passed a law in parliament, that is giving more reservations, EWS, economically weaker sections. That is what the governments will do. They said that they would double the farmers' income in 5 years. That was in 2017. They could not double it. They could not double the farmers' income. Then what did the government do? Give farmers 6,000 rupees. Doubling farmers' income requires implementing so many agrarian reforms. Doubling farmers' income requires increasing expenditure of the government on infrastructure in agriculture sector. Doubling farmers' income requires constructing warehouses. It requires cold storage houses. It requires improving technology in agriculture sector. It requires improving irrigation facilities. Even after 75 years of independence, only 45% of land is irrigated, agricultural land. Doubling farmers' income requires all these things. The government neither has the willpower, nor the commitment, nor the finances, nor the vision to do all those things. So what do the government do? The government simply look for easy way out. That is, give more subsidies. Give more subsidies. The government had come out with a solution in the form of PM Kisan. You cannot double the income by giving them free cash. You have to create opportunities for them to improve their productivity, output, ensure better remunerative prices for their products, remove the middlemen, and reduce their cost of production by improving infrastructure, and ensure better linkages between agriculture industry, food processing. And that is how you have to double the farmer income, which the government cannot do. That is the reason we come out with an easy solution in the form of this Kisan. This is where the problem with the government. Always conflict between objectives of citizen empowerment and welfare maximization. Next, another reason why these public policies are a failure is absence of accountability mechanisms in implementation processes. For example, who should be made accountable for implementation? Who should be made accountable for implementation of these policies? Bureaucracy, as we know, in a parliamentary democracy, there is no direct accountability of bureaucracy towards citizens in terms of implementation. Bureaucrats are accountable to their seniors within the administration, that's part of hierarchy, and they are accountable to political masters. But there is no accountability directly of bureaucracy for implementation processes. A district collector is a failure in implementing welfare schemes. He could not make sure that the benefits of these welfare schemes reach the targeted sections of society. Can all those beneficiaries make the district collector accountable legally? Can they file cases against him? Can they stop his promotion? Can they suspend him from service? That is not possible. There is no accountability mechanism in the implementation process. When there is no accountability, there will not be any efficiency also. When there is no accountability, there cannot be any efficiency also. And this is where, again, it was a failure. Again, it was a failure. Why? Because there is no accountability mechanism in terms of implementation processes. Next, as we have said, another reason why public policies are a failure. One size fits all approach to implementation. this one-size-fits-all approach to implementation. What do we mean by that one-size-fits-all approach? As we discussed, the obsession of the government with these centrally sponsored schemes. You start so many schemes and you say that every state government has to implement the scheme. Every state government has to implement the scheme, irrespective of the conditions prevailing in that particular state. And that is where the problem is. We give the example of NREGA. We give the example of irrigation schemes. You take this food security acts. Why? Because in a state like Bihar, more than 50% of population, as according to the recent study of Niti Aayog, is living below poverty line. So Bihar requires more amount of subsidies. Whereas in a state like Haryana, this is not the case. Why should you have a same program for Bihar and Haryana? MSP is very important for Bihar. Sorry, it is very important for Punjab and Haryana, but not for Bihar. So why do we have only one scheme, the entire country? Why do you have only one scheme for the entire country? And the conditions in Kerala are radically different from conditions in, say, Rajasthan. Rajasthan, completely desert state. Kerala, coastal state. So the same policy, can it be applied in both Kerala and Rajasthan? For example, what is the reason why the experiment with European Union was also not as successful as it should have been? Same one-size-fits-all approach, especially in terms of monetary policy. European Central Bank would decide the monetary policy for the entire European Union. Obviously, in European Union, some countries are developed, the Western European countries. The Asian European countries are relatively poor. So can all of them have the same kind of monetary policy? And that is where it is a problematic thing. And European Union, very few number of countries, the total population is also very less. Take the entire European Union. On the other hand, take the case of India, 1.4 billion people, 28 states, so many union territories, so many languages, so many regions, so much of difference in geography, so much of difference in climate, so much of difference in food habits, so much of difference in culture. Can this one-size-fits-all approach, can this obsession of the government with one-size-fits-all approach be successful? That is the reason why most of all these public policies are a failure. They are a failure because of this centralized top-down one-size-fits-all approach of the government. Obsession. That is where it is also a failure. Next, as we have discussed, high levels of corruption. This is what we have said. We thought that with technology, we will be able to reduce corruption. We thought that with technology, we will be able to reduce corruption. But that did not happen. As we study in e-governance, e-governance may help in improving efficiency of administration. It may help in improving efficiency of administration, but it can never eradicate corruption. Why? Because corruption is both systemic and systematic in nature. Without addressing these systemic and systematic issues in implementation, the government can never hope to reduce corruption. On the other hand, the central government, its commitment only in terms of allocating finances. For example, in this 80 crore people are given free food grains. That is what central government says. Out of which, only around 15-20 crore people require those food grains, or 25 crore people require those food grains. What about the remaining 55 crore people? Where are they getting those food grains? The government will never answer those kind of questions. Why? Because this is highly populistic in nature. The more number of people you are giving, the more chances of you winning elections. Within the same family, you can see that if there are 5 members in a family, all 5 of them will have ration cards. So, 5 members, you can imagine the number of the amount of rice they will be getting from the these PDS shops. That is where again the problem is. High levels of corruption. Next reason why these policies are a failure, implementation is a failure, is, I said, lack of awareness among the stakeholders regarding the developmental and welfare schemes. That is what we have mentioned. The central government is implementing 2,100 schemes. Added to the schemes of the state governments also. How many of those villagers know about all those schemes? How many of the people know about all those schemes? That results in failure of policies. Automatically, lack of awareness. Next, as you can see it on screen, conflict between policies. That can also result in failure of these public policies. For example, the government will adopt what we call expansionary fiscal policy. RBI will adopt contractionary monetary policy. This conflict ultimately results in failure of policies. For example, Ministry of Industries, they keep on giving licenses to projects, industrial projects, infrastructure projects. Then the Ministry of Environment and Forests, they keep on creating problems in the name of environmental rules and regulations. This conflict also will result in failure of public policies, especially in terms of their implementation. Right? Next important reason why they are a failure. Next important reason why they are a failure is because the commitment of the government is only in terms of outlays but not in terms of outcomes. In the budget, what we have is only what we call line item budgets, wherein the budget provides information about the items of expenditure and the amount of money allocated. What do we mean by that? For example, the government says that we are allocating NREGA 80,000 crores. But what we are going to achieve by spending 80,000 crores of rupees on NREGA? Are you creating any assets? Are you improving the life of the people in the long term? Are you providing any productive employment to the people? What are the outcomes you want to achieve? That is what exactly the problem is. The government always commits itself. For example, if the farmers are given 6,000 rupees, what are you going to achieve by giving 6,000 rupees? And for how long you are going to give them? And what you could have done better with those 6,000 rupees? That is never talked about by governments. That is where the problem. Similarly, if you look at this year's budget, pandemic year's budget, Finance Ministry probably announced that they have increased the allocation to the health sector from around 75,000 crores last year to 2,30,000 crores this year. They have said that they have increased the allocation by more than 235%, which is very good. But what are you going to achieve by spending so much amount of money? What about the outcomes? How many primary health care centers in villages are going to be fully functional by this expenditure? How many people in villages can have access to basic healthcare facilities? How many people can have access to better, personnel in terms of doctors and other medical personnel in villages? How many people in rural areas can expect better health outcomes? This is not at all mentioned in all those flagship schemes of the government. On top of it, the government will come out with more schemes. PMJAY, Jan Arogya Yojana. Ayushman Bharat was renamed as PMJAY. That is where the problem is. Once a scheme is a failure, once a policy is a failure, the government will immediately rename the policy and with more allocations. Make in India was a failure. The government had come out with a new policy in the form of Atmanirbhar Bharat and give more money to them and allocate more money to the new policies. That means the chances of the new policy becoming a failure are much more higher. This is another reason why we say public policy implementation is a failure in India. Next, as you can see here, non-involvement of local self-governments. This is where again public policies are a failure. Non-involvement of local self-governments. Next reason why this public policies implementation is a failure is as we have mentioned here on the screen also, inclusion and exclusion errors in implementation process. That means you are including undeserving beneficiaries in those schemes. I gave you the example. According to Niti Aayog, only 22% of population is living below poverty line. And if you go by the latest reports, only 6% of population is under in a severe poverty. But under the Food Security Act, you are providing food grains to 75% of population in rural areas and 50% of population in urban areas. Who are all those people? Do they deserve? You are including mostly undeserving beneficiaries. Exclusion errors. You are excluding those who deserve those benefits. For example, in state like Jharkhand or in some other poor states, what is happening? When the government has made it mandatory that this fingerprint should be matched, through this point of sale missions, Aadhaar. Most of the poor people, these rural laborers, because they work so hard in the fields, their fingerprints may change. When they don't match, they will not be in a position to receive the benefit. They are excluded. This is where the problem is. This is where the problem is. That is the reason why, again, the public policies are a failure in our country. Implementation because of inclusion and exclusion errors. For example, midday meal scheme. Most of the children are not able to get the quality food. Why? Because during this pandemic, what happened? For almost 18 months, the schools did not function. The midday meal scheme is only when the schools function. So obviously, it resulted in most of the children being deprived of even quality food also. That again results in the failure. Then finally, why these public policies are a failure? Obsession of bureaucracy with targets. For example, you are a district collector, you are given the responsibility of implementing a right to education, Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan, Samagra Shiksha Abhiyan. You are only concerned about enrolling more number of students into the school and send a report to the central government saying that I have ensured more enrollment of children in the schools. That is what is called outputs or targets. Our bureaucracy is obsessed with outputs, not with outcomes. Whether the children are getting a quality education, you are not concerned. Whether the teachers are teaching better in the schools, you are not concerned. Whether the government schools have basic facilities or not, you are not concerned. You are only concerned about one thing, that is whether you are able to achieve your targets or not. That is where, again, the public policies are a failure in terms of their implementation. As you can see, these are all the reasons why public policies are a failure. Please remember, each one of them can be asked, has also been asked as a question in our polity governance papers. And what are the solutions? Solutions is not far to seek here. Once we know the problems, we can easily know all the solutions also. We must involve stakeholders. We must ensure complete transparency. We must end our obsession with the one-size-fits-all approach top-down approach. We must involve local self-governments. We must provide sensitivity training to bureaucracy. There should be social audit of developmental welfare schemes. Syrian Charter should be made mandatory for all these welfare and developmental schemes. We must exclude unwanted, undeserving beneficiaries so that we can reduce the cost of production. We must ensure complete transparency so that we can eradicate corruption. We must fix accountability mechanisms. We should also have effective grievance redressal mechanisms. And we must involve the stakeholders in implementation processes. That is what we say the solutions for all these implementation failures. And most importantly, the focus should be on empowering the people in the long term by spending more money on capital expenditure, by spending more money on investment expenditure, by spending more money on infrastructure development, so that people don't have to depend on the government for their survival. So that ultimately we can move really towards what is called poverty removal than being satisfied with poverty alleviation. Right? This is what it is all about. The reasons for failure of public policies. Right? This should be more than sufficient. I think we also have reached the end of our time also. Tomorrow at the same time we will come out with another interesting topic. Right? Till then, take care of yourself and best of luck.